6, the Honourable Annette King.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Minister of Health. What is the estimated cost to Vote Health of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement?
The Honourable Dr Jonathan Coleman.
Mr Speaker, the best estimate of the cost to Vote Health from the TPPA is $4.5 million in one-off costs and $2.2 million per year in ongoing operating costs to Pharmac. That is a tiny 14 thousandths of 1% of the $15.9 billion health budget. The government does not foresee any additional costs to Pharmac from the provisions relating to biologic drugs. Consumers will not pay more for subsidised medicines as a result of TPPA. Most prescribed medicines are fully subsidised, and New Zealanders will still pay no more than $5 per prescription item. The TPP does not change this in any way. Pharmac's ability to negotiate with drug companies to keep prices down is unchanged.
Question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, the Honourable Annette King.
What has he been informed are the, quote, comparable outcomes, end quote, to enable New Zealand to deliver a longer period than the current 5 years data exclusivity on biologics under the TPP?
The Honourable Dr Jonathan Coleman.
The point underlying that question is that we don't need to make any change to our policy settings to fulfil the requirements of TPP.
Order. Point of
The question I asked, has he been informed what are the comparable outcomes?
I'll allow
the
member to repeat the question.
What has he been informed are, quote, comparable outcomes to enable New Zealand to deliver a longer period than the current 5 years on data exclusivity on biologics under the TPP?
The Honourable Dr Jonathan Coleman.
Well, they're those delivered by the existing policy measures. So you've got 20-year patent protection. That remains intact. That is going to exceed the 5-year data protection. And when you put that together with MedSafe process, that actually meets the requirements of the TPPA.
Supplementary question, the Honourable Annette King.
Has he been informed what a comparable outcome would mean in actual years added on to the 5-year data exclusivity protection in New Zealand with changes negotiated under the TPP?
The Honourable Dr Jonathan Coleman.
Well, there won't be any change because our existing policy framework meets all the requirements of the TPP. That's true.
Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question. Order. Right Honourable Prime Minister, supplementary question.
To the Minister, what does the Minister think will be the impact on the health budget if and when the New Zealand economy is much larger and more successful as a result of having such a good free trade agreement?
Well, that's the best question.
And as far as there's a ministerial responsibility,
that's
the Honourable Dr Jonathan
of the
Coleman.
I mean, the reality of it is that because we've signed up to TPP, we're going to have the economy increasing by 2.7 billion per year by 2030. That is going to mean that we're going to have much more money to put into the health budget to provide more medicines and better care for New Zealanders over time. It's a real shame that Labor can't make up their mind whether to support this or not.
Supplementary question, the Honourable Annette King.
What will be the cost to the health of New Zealanders of a 1-year delay in making biologic drugs available in light of an article in the Medical Journal of Australia which states pharmaceutical monopoly protections cost Australia taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars each year?
The Honourable Dr Jonathan
Well,
Coleman.
Mr Speaker, don't forget, this is the member that said TPP would cost $1 billion.
Order. It's a very simple question that's been asked of the Minister. Be advised and answer it, please.
It's a very complex hypothetical question. As what I've said is that there will be no added cost. It won't be the $1 billion that Annette King said would be added.
Order. I'll hear from the Honourable Annette King.
The Minister has to bring in the Labor Party into the answer when it was a straightforward question.
Order. No, the question has the first attempt. Order. My patience will probably run out fairly quickly with this member. The question was not attempted to be answered in the first place. I took issue with the Minister and he now has, to my satisfaction, addressed the question. If the member has further supplementaries, that is the way to proceed. I'll hear from the... Yes, you can. The Minister can complete his answer
So
briefly.
I just want to clarify, It won't cost $1 billion a year, as Annette King said. It won't cost lives, as Annette King said. And most importantly of all, it won't undermine the Pharmac model, as Annette King said. So, quite frankly, she needs to apologise to New Zealanders and stop trying to...
Order, member. Order. Supplementary question, the Honourable Annette King.
Does he agree with Tim Grosser in relation to Pharmac and the decisions made under the TPP agreement, quote, there is constructive ambiguity?
The Honourable Dr Jonathan Coleman.
Well, I haven't seen that quote. I mean, you may well be making it up, but I'll have to check with Mr Grosser now.
I take exception to being told I made things up. That is, I'm sure the Minister of Trade will confirm it.
Order.
The Minister of Trade will confirm it.
Order. I'm on my feet. It was certainly not a helpful remark from the Minister. I accept that, but it's hardly one that I think the member should take offence at. If she really requires me to ask the member to withdraw, I will do so. Is the member offended by that remark?
Point of order, Mr Speaker. No, point of order, Mr.
No,
Speaker.
I'll allow the member.
No, Mr Speaker, I won't ask him to withdraw. I won't.
Okay, yeah.
I'd just ask if it's possible for the Minister of Trade to confirm what I just said.
No, that's not a point of order at all. Is there further supplementaries? There is not. Question number 7.